November 2nd, 1942. Somewhere over occupied France, Hauptmann Egon Meyer pulled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a steep climb, watching the approaching formation of American B-17 flying fortresses through his gun sight. Meyer was no novice. He had 21 confirmed kills already. He had flown against the British over the Channel. He had learned to respect the Royal Air Force's night bombers. But these Americans, with their daylight bombing doctrine, their belief that heavy bombers could protect themselves without fighter escort, this was different. This was, in Meyer's assessment, arrogance. The B-17's approached in their standard formation, 18 aircraft arranged in defensive boxes, each bomber bristling with machine guns. Meyer knew the specifications. The B-17E model carried 9 50-caliber machine guns. The newer F model had 11. American crews called it the Flying Fortress. The name, Meyer thought, was propaganda. No bomber could withstand a determined fighter attack. The mathematics were simple. A Focke-Wulf 190 carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A Messerschmitt 109 carried 1 20mm cannon and 2 7.9mm machine guns. One fighter could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on a single target. The bombers, despite their defensive armament, were vulnerable. Meyer had learned this through experience. The standard attack profile was to come in from behind, slightly below, and pour cannon fire into the bomber's engines and fuselage. The tail gunner would engage, certainly. The dorsal gunner might get a clear shot, but the fighter's closing speed was so high, the engagement window so brief, that bomber gunners rarely scored hits. Over the past months, Meyer and his fellow pilots had developed their tactics. They had learned to attack from the rear quarter, where the B-17's defensive fire was weakest. They had perfected their gunnery at high deflection angles. They had calculated the exact range at which their 20mm cannons were most effective. But on this morning, watching the American formation approach, Meyer noticed something. The tail guns were tracking him. Both of them. 50-caliber weapons, he knew. Heavier than the 7.9mm guns on his Messerschmitt. Longer range. The Americans had finally installed proper tail turrets with twin guns. This changed the calculation slightly. Attacking from directly behind was now more dangerous. The tail gunner had real firepower. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Meyer rolled his fighter and came around for a different approach. He would attack from the side, from the beam, where the waist gunners had to track a fast-moving target. His wingmen followed. They closed at 400 kilometers per hour. The range closed rapidly. 300 meters, 200. The waist guns opened fire. Meyer saw the tracers arc past his canopy. 50-caliber rounds. The Americans used one tracer for every 5 rounds, so each visible streak represented 4 unseen bullets. The volume of fire was impressive, but the gunners were leading him incorrectly. The tracers passed behind his aircraft. He pressed his trigger. 20mm shells marched across the B-17's wing. He saw strikes, metal fragments spinning away. He pulled up hard, rolled inverted, and dove away from the formation. As he climbed for another pass, Meyer analyzed what he had seen. The American gunners were brave. They had engaged immediately at maximum range, but their accuracy was poor. The training was insufficient. The 50-caliber machine guns were good weapons, but the men behind them were inexperienced. This was exploitable. Meyer's wingman rejoined him. Together they positioned for another attack. This time they would come from the front quarter, exploiting the B-17's weakest point. The nose of the bomber had only 2 manually aimed guns. No turret, no power traverse. Just 2 flexible weapons aimed by hand. The bombardier and navigator operated them. Neither man was a trained gunner. Both had other primary duties. The nose was vulnerable. Meyer dove toward the formation, building speed. His wingman stayed close. They were coming in at a combined closing speed exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. The engagement would last seconds. Meyer centered the lead bomber in his gun sight and waited. The range counter unwound rapidly. 1,000 meters, 800, 600. At 400 meters, he squeezed the trigger. His cannon shells tore into the B-17's nose. The plexiglass shattered. He saw strikes on the cockpit. The bomber's nose guns fired back, tracers reaching toward him, but at this closing speed, hitting anything was nearly impossible. Both aircraft streaked past each other. Meyer rolled and looked back. The lead bomber was streaming smoke from its number 1 engine. Good hits, but it was still flying. The formation was still intact. The other bombers had not broken formation. They continued toward their target, steady and relentless. Meyer and his wingman made 3 more passes. They scored additional hits. 1 bomber dropped out of formation, 1 engine dead, trailing smoke. But the cost was high. Meyer's wingman took hits from return fire. The Messerschmitt's coolant system was damaged. His wingman had to break off and limp home. And the American bombers kept coming. Meyer realized something that morning that would reshape Luftwaffe tactics for the next 2 years. The B-17's defensive armament was not overwhelming. Individual bombers were vulnerable. But the Americans did not fight as individuals. They fought as a formation. And when they fought as a formation, the mathematics changed entirely. That afternoon, back at his airfield, Meyer wrote a report for his commander. The report detailed his observations. The American bomber formations concentrated defensive fire to a degree that surprised him. When attacking from the rear, multiple tail gunners from adjacent bombers could engage a single fighter. When attacking from the side, waist gunners from 3 or 4 bombers could bring their weapons to bear. The only approach that offered a reasonable probability of success was the head-on attack, but even that approach carried significant risk. The combined closing speed was so high that the engagement window was measured in fractions of a second. A pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to aim, fire, and pull away before collision. Meyer proposed a new tactical doctrine. Fighters should attack in formation, multiple aircraft approaching from 12 o'clock high, all firing simultaneously. The concentrated firepower would overwhelm the limited nose armament. The simultaneous attack would prevent the bombers from concentrating defensive fire on any single fighter. It was a tactic that required discipline, coordination, and courage. The pilots would be flying directly toward heavy bombers, closing at maximum speed with minimal time to maneuver. 1 mistake, 1 hesitation, meant collision. But Meyer believed it would work. His commander agreed. The head-on attack became standard Luftwaffe doctrine by December of 1942. What Meyer could not know, what German intelligence had not yet grasped, was that the Americans were watching too. They were analyzing every engagement. They were studying the gun camera footage. They were interviewing returning crews. And they were adapting faster than the Luftwaffe anticipated. In factories in Seattle, in Long Beach, in Tulsa, Boeing engineers were already designing modifications to the B-17 that would counter the head-on attack. In training schools across America, gunners were learning lessons purchased with blood over Europe. And in England, at 8th Air Force headquarters, commanders were developing a formation doctrine that would transform the Flying Fortress from a vulnerable heavy bomber into the centerpiece of the most devastating aerial campaign in history. The Americans called it the combat box. The Germans would call it something else. They would call it a kill zone, a 3-dimensional fortress of interlocking fire that turned the sky itself into a weapon. But that transformation was still months away. In November of 1942, the war in the air over Europe was entering a new phase. The Germans held the advantage. Their fighters were superior. Their pilots were experienced. Their tactics were evolving. But the Americans had something the Germans did not fully comprehend. They had industrial capacity on a scale that could replace losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. They had engineering capability that could iterate designs in months rather than years. And they had crews willing to fly into hell itself if they believed their sacrifice served a purpose. On August 17, 1943, the United States 8th Air Force launched its most ambitious operation to date. 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from airfields across eastern England. Their targets were Schweinfurt, and Regensburg. Schweinfurt held Germany's ball-bearing factories. Ball bearings were essential for tanks, aircraft, and vehicles. Destroying Schweinfurt's factories would cripple German production. Regensburg held Messerschmitt's primary fighter aircraft plant. Destroying Regensburg would reduce the Luftwaffe's ability to replace combat losses. The plan was elegant in concept. The Regensburg force would strike first, then continue south to land at airfields in North Africa. The Schweinfurt force would follow 10 minutes later. German fighters would engage the first wave, land to refuel and rearm, and have insufficient time to intercept the second wave. 2 targets, 1 coordinated strike, maximum impact, minimum exposure to German defences. The plan depended on precise timing. The weather did not cooperate. Fog blanketed eastern England on the morning of August 17th. The Regensburg force took off on schedule. They had to reach North Africa before darkness. The Schweinfurt force remained grounded. The fog was too thick for safe formation assembly. The delay was 5 hours. What should have been a coordinated double strike became 2 separate attacks. German radar operators watched the first formation cross the Dutch coast at 10:05 in the morning. They tracked it across Holland, across Belgium, into German airspace. Fighter controllers scrambled units from 24 airfields. Over 300 fighters rose to engage. The Regensburg force had fighter escort for the first portion of their route. British Spitfires accompanied them to Antwerp. American P-47 Thunderbolts flew with them as far as the Belgian border. Then the escorts turned back. Range limitations. The bombers continued alone. 146 B-17's flying deep into Germany without protection. The German fighters waited until the American escorts departed, then attacked. They came in formations of 4, 6, sometimes 12 aircraft. They used the head-on attack that Egon Meyer had perfected. They dove from high altitude, built tremendous speed, and bore straight into the bomber formations. The engagement over Regensburg was brutal. Hauptmann Heinz Nock, flying a Messerschmitt 109, later described it. "We attacked from 12 o'clock high. 6 of us in line abreast. The closing speed was incredible. You had perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before you had to pull up or risk collision. The American nose guns were firing. You saw the tracers coming at you. But at that closing speed, hitting anything required exceptional marksmanship or luck." Nock pressed his attack. He focused on the lead bomber, in the formation. His 20mm cannon shells walked across the bomber's nose. He saw the plexiglass shatter. He saw strikes on the cockpit. Then he was past, pulling up hard, his Messerschmitt shuddering from the G-forces. He looked back. The lead bomber was falling out of formation, one engine trailing fire. But 20 seconds later, another bomber had moved up to take its place. The formation held. They continued toward Regensburg. Nock climbed for another pass. His wingman was gone. Mechanical failure? In the chaos of the engagement, there was no way to know. Nock was alone now. He positioned for another head-on attack, dove, fired, pulled away. Another bomber damaged, another bomber falling, but the formation kept coming. The Regensburg force reached their target at noon. They bombed the Messerschmitt factory. The bombing was accurate. Post-raid photo reconnaissance showed substantial damage, but the cost was 24 bombers. 24 B-17's shot down, 240 crew members killed, captured, or missing. The survivors turned south, flying toward North Africa, the German fighters pursuing them beyond German borders until fuel forced them to break off. At 4:50 in the afternoon, the surviving bombers began landing at airfields in Algeria. 122 aircraft, 24 lost, an attrition rate of 16%. Unsustainable losses. Back in England, the Schweinfurt force had finally assembled. 230 B-17's formed up and set course for Germany. It was 3 in the afternoon, 5 hours behind schedule. The German fighter units that had engaged the Regensburg force had landed, refueled, rearmed. They were waiting. German radar tracked the second formation from the moment it crossed the coast. Fighter controllers positioned their units. This time there would be no surprise. This time the Germans would be ready. The Schweinfurt force had the same escort, profile as Regensburg, Spitfires to Antwerp, Thunderbolts to the Belgian border. Then the bombers were alone. The German attack began at the German border. Focke-Wulf 190 AS came in from 12 o'clock high. Messerschmitt 109s attacked from the beam. Twin-engine Messerschmitt 1-10 Zerstorers fired rockets from beyond the range of the bombers' defensive guns. The 21-centimeter Werfer granate rockets were new. They had been tested in combat the day before. Each rocket carried a 40-kilogram warhead. A direct hit would destroy a bomber outright. A near miss would damage a bomber severely enough to force it out of formation, and a bomber out of formation was a bomber that would die. The Zerstorers fired from 1,800 meters, well beyond the effective range of 50-caliber machine guns. The rockets arced toward the formation. Most missed, but several struck home. Bombers exploded. Others fell away, trailing smoke and fire. The lead wing of the Schweinfurt force took catastrophic losses. 22 bombers shot down before reaching the target. The survivors bombed Schweinfurt at 3:40 in the afternoon. Accuracy was moderate. Some factories were hit. Others were missed. The bombing results, while significant, were not decisive. And now the bombers had to fly home, through 300 kilometers of hostile airspace, with German fighters that had been reinforced by fresh units. The return flight was a running battle that lasted nearly 2 hours. German fighters attacked continuously. They had learned the American formation weaknesses. They targeted the low squadron, the coffin corner position that had the least mutual fire support. They attacked damaged bombers that had fallen behind. They exploited every gap in the formation. Staff Sergeant Meyer Gitlin, a waist gunner on a bomber called Sky Chariot, later described the engagement. The fighters came at us in waves, 6 at a time, line abreast, boring straight in from the nose. Our bombardier and navigator were firing their nose guns, but at that closing speed, you just couldn't track them fast enough. Then they'd flash past and the tail gunner would engage. But by then they were already pulling up for another pass. It was relentless. Gitlin's bomber took multiple hits. The number 3 engine was damaged. The hydraulic system failed. The electrical system failed. Half the defensive guns jammed from loss of power. The tail gunner was killed. The ball turret gunner was critically wounded. The aircraft fell out of formation. Other bombers closed ranks. There was no room for stragglers. Sky Chariot was alone now, alone and vulnerable. German fighters swarmed it. They came from every angle, front, sides, rear. The remaining gunners fired back, but with only 3 operational guns, they could not cover all approaches. The pilot, First Lieutenant Rowley King, dove for the deck, desperately seeking cloud cover. There was none. The bomber staggered through, the air, losing altitude, trailing smoke from 2 engines. The German fighters pressed their attacks, more hits, more damage, and then, inexplicably, the fighters broke off. A German pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, had seen enough. He had positioned for what should have been a kill shot. The bomber was helpless, but when he closed to firing range, he saw the devastation. The tail gunner was dead, the waist gunner was wounded. The aircraft was shattered, barely flying. Stigler was a veteran pilot with 22 kills. He knew the rules of aerial combat. He also knew the unwritten rules. You did not shoot men in parachutes. You did not strafe life rafts. And you did not murder helpless crews who could not fight back. Stigler made a decision that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. Instead of firing, he flew alongside the crippled bomber. He escorted it. He used his presence to prevent other German fighters from attacking. He guided it toward the coast. When Sky Chariot reached the North Sea, Stigler saluted the American crew and turned back toward Germany. Lieutenant King brought the shattered bomber home to England. Sky Chariot landed at an emergency airfield. The aircraft was written off, too damaged to repair. But the crew survived. Back over Germany, the main Schweinfurt force was still fighting its way home. The running battle continued until British fighters arrived over Belgium to provide cover for the final leg. At 6 in the evening, the surviving bombers began landing at their English bases. Ground crews counted them in. 194 aircraft returned. 36 were missing. 11 more were damaged beyond repair. Total losses: 47 bombers, 470 crew members, another attrition rate exceeding 16%. The Americans claimed they had shot down 186 German fighters. The claim was wildly optimistic. German records show actual losses of 27 fighters destroyed, with another 22 damaged. The discrepancy was understandable. In the chaos of air combat, multiple gunners would claim the same fighter. A damaged aircraft streaming smoke would be reported as destroyed by several crews. The Americans had no way to verify kills over enemy territory, but the mathematics of the exchange were clear. The Luftwaffe lost 27 fighters. The 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers. Each bomber carried a crew of 10. 600 men lost for 27 enemy fighters destroyed. The math was unsustainable. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, reviewed the mission reports with growing concern. The losses were catastrophic. At this rate, the entire bomber force would be destroyed before Germany's industrial capacity was seriously damaged. The pre-war doctrine that heavily armed bombers could defend themselves without fighter escort had been proven false. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a magnificent aircraft. Its defensive armament was impressive. But it was not enough. Not against determined, experienced Luftwaffe pilots who had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the bomber's weaknesses. Eaker knew the solution. Long-range fighter escorts, fighters that could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. But in August of 1943, no such fighter existed in operational service. The P-47 Thunderbolt had the firepower but lacked the range. The P-38 Lightning had better range but was too scarce. The P-51 Mustang, the fighter that would ultimately solve the problem, was still months away from deployment to Europe in significant numbers. Until long-range escorts arrived, the bombers would have to face the Luftwaffe alone, which meant the bombers would continue to die. The Schweinfurt raid had damaged ball-bearing production, but not enough. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, reviewed the damage reports and calculated that production had dropped by 38%, significant but not crippling. Germany had stockpiles. The factories could be repaired. Production would resume. More critically, Speer realized that if the Americans did not immediately follow up with repeated raids, Germany would have time to disperse production and rebuild reserves. The Americans did not immediately follow up. They could not. The losses had been too severe. The 8th Air Force needed time to rebuild. New aircraft had to be shipped from America. New crews had to be trained. Damaged bombers had to be repaired. The planned follow-up raids were postponed. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The delay gave Germany exactly what Speer needed: time. Ball-bearing production was dispersed to smaller facilities across Germany and occupied territory. Stockpiles were rebuilt. By October, German production had recovered. But the Americans had not forgotten Schweinfurt. Intelligence still identified the ball-bearing factories as a critical choke point in German war production. The factories had to be destroyed. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt. This time they sent the entire force. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses, every available bomber, every trained crew. It was the largest single raid the Americans had yet attempted. The crews knew what awaited them. The mission briefing elicited groans when Schweinfurt was announced. They had seen the loss reports from August. They knew the mathematics. 1 in 6 bombers had not returned. Those were poor odds. Lieutenant John Luckadoo, a pilot with the 100th Bomb Group, sat through the briefing with growing dread. His group had been devastated in recent missions. They had lost aircraft over Bremen, over Anklam, over Münster. Now they were returning to Schweinfurt, the target that had cost 60 bombers in August. Luckadoo's crew climbed aboard their assigned B-17. They performed their pre-flight checks. They taxied into position. They took off and joined the formation, assembling over England. 291 bombers formed into combat boxes. The boxes were a new tactical formation developed over the past months. The combat box was designed to maximize defensive firepower. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commander of the 305th Bombardment Group, had pioneered the concept. The combat box arranged bombers in a staggered formation, with aircraft at different altitudes and lateral positions. The stagger allowed every bomber's guns to cover adjacent aircraft. It created overlapping fields of fire. It meant that a fighter attacking any bomber in the formation would be engaged by gunners from multiple aircraft. The combat box was the American answer to the Luftwaffe's head-on attack. It transformed individual bombers into a unified defensive system, but it had not yet been tested under the conditions the crews would face. Over Schweinfurt, the formation crossed the English coast. Spitfires joined them for the first leg. Over Belgium, P-47 Thunderbolts took over escort duties. The Thunderbolts now carried drop tanks, external fuel tanks that extended their range. But even with drop tanks, the Thunderbolts could only escort the bombers to the western edge of Germany. Beyond that point, the bombers would be alone. At the German border, the Thunderbolts turned back. The bomber crews watched them go. Then they turned their attention forward, toward Germany, toward Schweinfurt, toward what would become known as Black Thursday. The German fighters were waiting. This time they attacked early. They engaged the American escort fighters over Belgium, forcing the P-47s to jettison their drop tanks prematurely. The Thunderbolts now had even less range. They had to turn back earlier. The German fighters disengaged from the escorts and waited. When the Thunderbolts departed, the massacre began. The formation crossed the English coast at 10 in the morning. The bombers climbed to operational altitude, 25,000 feet. At that altitude, the temperature was 40 degrees below zero. The crews wore electrically heated flight suits, but the cold still penetrated. Guns froze. Oxygen systems failed. Men sat at their stations, watching their breath turn to ice crystals inside their masks. At the German border, the escorts turned back. The bombers were alone. What followed was 6 hours of continuous combat. The German fighters attacked in waves. They came from the front, from the sides, from above and below. They fired rockets from beyond defensive gun range. They closed to point-blank range with cannons blazing. They rammed damaged bombers when their ammunition was exhausted. Lieutenant Heinz Nock led his formation in a head-on attack against the lead combat box. 6 Messerschmitt 109s in line abreast, diving from 30,000 feet. The closing speed was 850 kilometers per hour. At that speed, the engagement lasted 3 seconds. Nock fired a 2-second burst. His cannon shells struck the lead bomber's cockpit and number 2 engine. Then he was past, pulling up so hard that his vision grayed from the G-forces. He looked back. The lead bomber was falling out of formation, both left engines trailing fire. But another bomber had already moved into the lead position. The formation continued toward Schweinfurt. Nock positioned for another pass. This time he attacked from the beam, coming in at the squadron's low element. The waist gunners engaged him at 600 meters. He saw tracers arcing toward his aircraft. 50 caliber rounds. At that range, they still had significant velocity. One struck his canopy. The armored glass cracked but held. Another struck his wing, tearing a hole the size of a dinner plate. Nock fired his cannon. He walked his shells across a bomber's fuselage. He saw strikes on the wing root. The bomber's number 3 engine exploded. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away. Technical Sergeant Robert Johnson, a ball turret gunner on a bomber called Patches, tracked the Messerschmitt as it flashed past. Johnson had already fired 600 rounds that morning. His guns were hot. The hydraulic fluid that powered the turret was leaking from flak damage. But the turret still worked. Johnson swung his twin 50 caliber machine guns, leading the fighter, calculating deflection instinctively. He pressed his triggers. The guns hammered. Tracers reached out. He saw strikes on the fighter's tail. The Messerschmitt rolled and dove away, trailing smoke. Johnson did not claim a kill. In the chaos, He could not confirm whether the fighter crashed, but he had damaged it. He had driven it off. That was enough. The combat box formation was working. When German fighters attacked from the front, nose gunners and bombardiers engaged them. When they attacked from the sides, waist gunners and ball turret gunners brought their weapons to bear. When they attacked from behind, tail gunners defended. And, critically, when a fighter attacked one bomber, gunners from adjacent aircraft could engage the same target. The overlapping fields of fire created a zone of destruction that German pilots had to penetrate. Staff Sergeant Willis Fraser, a top turret gunner on a bomber called Lucky Lady, recorded his experience in a diary he kept against regulations. The fighters came at us for hours. Every time we thought it was over, more appeared. Our own fighter escort had turned back at the border. We were alone over Germany. But we were not helpless. Every time a German fighter lined up for an attack run, 5 or 6 of our gunners were shooting at him. The sky was filled with tracers. I saw fighters go down. I saw them break off attacks because the fire was too heavy. The formation worked. We covered each other. Fraser's bomber took 17 flak hits and 3 cannon strikes from fighters. The number 4 engine was damaged. The right waist gunner was wounded. But the bomber stayed in formation. It continued to Schweinfurt. It dropped its bombs, and it fought its way home. The bombing over Schweinfurt began at 2:30 in the afternoon. 229 bombers dropped over 500 tons of bombs on the ball-bearing factories. Smoke rose to 20,000 feet. Fires burned across the industrial district. Post-raid reconnaissance would show substantial damage, but the cost was catastrophic. The German fighters never stopped attacking. They pursued the bombers all the way back to the German border, where British Spitfires finally appeared to provide cover for the final leg home. 60 B-17's were shot down. 642 airmen were killed, wounded, or missing. Another 17 bombers were damaged so severely they would never fly again. 121 more returned with significant battle damage. 291 bombers that launched that morning, only 115 returned undamaged. The attrition rate was 21%. At that rate, the entire 8th Air Force would be destroyed in 5 missions. The mathematics were unsustainable. No Air Force could absorb those losses and continue operations. General Ira Eaker reviewed the mission reports with his staff. The discussion was grim. The ball-bearing factories had been damaged, but German production would recover. Albert Speer had already demonstrated remarkable ability to disperse and rebuild industrial capacity. The attack on Schweinfurt would need to be repeated. But the 8th Air Force could not repeat it. Not at these loss rates. The deep penetration raids were suspended. For the next 4 months, American bombers would strike only targets within range of fighter escort. No more missions deep into Germany. No more raids on critical industrial targets beyond the reach of P-47, Thunderbolts and Spitfires. The Luftwaffe had won. Black Thursday, as October 14th came to be known, represented the nadir of American strategic bombing doctrine. The pre-war theory that self-defending bomber formations could strike targets without fighter escort had been disproven conclusively. The B-17 Flying Fortress, despite its 1350 caliber machine guns, despite its combat box formations, despite the courage of its crews, could not survive over Germany without fighter protection. The American bombers needed what they did not have: long-range fighter escorts. Fighters that could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. Fighters that could engage and destroy German interceptors before they reached the bomber formations. In October of 1943, no such fighter existed in operational service with the 8th Air Force. But it was coming. The North American P-51 Mustang. In December of 1943, the first P-51B Mustangs arrived in England. The 354th Fighter Group received them first. The pilots, who had been flying Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, were skeptical. The Thunderbolt was a proven fighter. It was rugged, reliable, and heavily armed. The Mustang looked fragile by comparison. It had an inline liquid-cooled engine instead of the Thunderbolt's radial air-cooled power plant. A single well-placed hit could rupture the cooling system and force an emergency landing. The Mustang was lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than the Thunderbolt. But would it survive in combat? The answer came on December 5, 1943. The 354th Fighter Group flew its first escort mission with P-51 Mustangs. The target was a rail yard in France, range from England, 200 miles, well within Thunderbolt range. But the mission was a test. Could the Mustang perform in combat? The Mustang exceeded expectations. It was faster than the Messerschmitt 109 at all altitudes. It could outturn the Focke-Wulf 190 at medium and high altitude. It had 6 50-caliber machine guns, with ammunition for sustained combat. And most critically, it had range. With internal fuel and 2 external drop tanks, the P-51B could fly over 1,600 miles. That was enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The 8th Air Force immediately ordered more Mustangs. Every available P-51 was diverted to England. Fighter groups began converting from Thunderbolts to Mustangs. By March of 1944, multiple groups were operational with the new fighter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And in February of 1944, the strategic bombing campaign resumed with an operation called Big Week. Big Week was a coordinated offensive targeting German aircraft production. The plan called for maximum effort raids on Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Junkers factories across Germany. The bombers would be escorted by every available fighter. P-51 Mustangs would provide deep penetration escort. P-47 Thunderbolts would cover the withdrawal. P-38 Lightnings would sweep ahead of the formations. For the first time, American bombers would have continuous fighter protection from England to targets deep in Germany and back. The Luftwaffe rose to defend. But this time, they faced not just bombers, but fighters that could outperform them. The P-51 Mustang pilots had been given new orders. They were no longer limited to close escort. They were free to pursue and destroy German fighters wherever they found them. The change in tactics was revolutionary. Previously, escort fighters stayed close to the bomber formations. German fighters could attack, break off, and escape before the escorts could engage. Now, Mustang pilots ranged ahead of the bombers, hunting German fighters as they assembled for attacks. The psychological impact was immediate. German pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking bombers with minimal interference from short-range escorts suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against superior American fighters. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, the pilot who had attacked the Schweinfurt raid in October, faced Mustangs for the first time in February of 1944. He later wrote about the experience. The Americans had a new fighter. We saw them escorting the bombers far beyond the range where Thunderbolts normally turned back. They were fast, they were maneuverable, and there were many of them. When we positioned to attack the bombers, the Mustangs engaged us. We could not break through to the bombers. We had to fight the escorts first. And the escorts were winning. Nock survived Big Week. Many of his fellow pilots did not. During the week-long offensive, the Luftwaffe lost over 400 fighters destroyed or damaged. More critically, they lost experienced pilots who could not be replaced. The Americans lost 226 bombers during Big Week, losses that would have been catastrophic 6 months earlier. But American industrial capacity was producing bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Every lost B-17 was replaced within a week. Every lost crew was replaced within a month. The German pilots killed during Big Week were irreplaceable. The training pipeline could not produce experienced fighter pilots at the rate they were being lost. And now, with Mustang escorts, the loss rate was accelerating. By March of 1944, the 8th Air Force was flying deep penetration raids regularly. Berlin, Leipzig, Brunswick. Schweinfurt again. Every target previously considered too distant or too heavily defended was now within reach. On March 6, 1944, over 600 B-17's, B-24s struck Berlin for the first time in daylight. They were escorted by 800 fighters, most of them P-51 Mustangs. The German capital, Hermann Göring's promised invincible fortress, was bombed in broad daylight. The Luftwaffe responded with every available fighter. Over 300 Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters engaged the American formations. The battle over Berlin lasted 3 hours. German fighters attacked the bomber formations using every tactic they had developed. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, beam attacks from 3 and 9 o'clock, rocket attacks from beyond gun range. But the American fighters were everywhere. The Mustangs swept ahead of the bombers, engaging German fighters as they assembled. The Thunderbolts provided close escort, fending off attacks that penetrated the fighter screen. The combat boxes maintained their formations, their overlapping fields of fire destroying fighters that got through the escorts. 69 American bombers were lost, 69 crews, but the Germans lost 160 fighters. The exchange rate had reversed. For every American bomber lost, the Luftwaffe lost more than 2 fighters, and the Americans could afford the losses, the Germans could not. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, the pilot who had escorted the damaged B-17 Sky Chariot to safety in August of 1943, witnessed the transformation. By March of 1944, he was a squadron leader. He had 30 kills, but he knew the war in the air was lost. He later described his realization. The Americans came with hundreds of bombers and hundreds of fighters. We would shoot down 20, 30, sometimes 40 bombers, but they kept coming. The next day, there would be another raid. More bombers, more fighters. We could not sustain the losses. Every mission, we lost pilots, good pilots, experienced pilots. The Americans lost bombers, but they had unlimited bombers. They had unlimited crews. We had nothing. We were bleeding to death. The combat box formations that had struggled to survive in October of 1943 now dominated the skies over Germany, not because the formations had changed, but because they were protected. The B-17's 1350 caliber machine guns provided formidable defensive firepower, but that firepower was most effective when German fighters had to penetrate through layers of American escort fighters to reach the bombers. A German pilot attempting a head-on attack now had to first avoid or fight through Mustang escorts. If he succeeded, he faced the concentrated fire of the combat box. If he survived his attack and broke away, he faced more escorts on the withdrawal. The mathematics had shifted decisively. In the autumn of 1943, German fighters could attack bomber formations with a reasonable expectation of survival. By spring of 1944, attacking American bomber formations was nearly suicidal. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, watched the destruction of his air force with mounting despair. He had promised Hitler that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. Now American bombers struck Berlin in daylight almost weekly. He had dismissed the P-51 Mustang as impossible when intelligence reports first described it. No single-engine fighter could have that range. The reports had to be exaggerated, but the reports were accurate. The Mustang existed, and it was destroying the Luftwaffe. In a meeting with his staff in April of 1944, Göring reportedly stated, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. The arrival of long-range escort fighters changed everything. The Americans could now strike any target in Germany with acceptable losses. The German aircraft industry was systematically destroyed. The oil refineries were bombed repeatedly. The transportation network was shattered. And the Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air force in the world, was reduced to desperate measures. By June of 1944, German fighter pilots were ordered to ram American bombers if they ran out of ammunition. Some obeyed. Most did not. Ramming attacks were suicide missions. Few pilots survived, but the desperation of the order revealed the depth of Germany's crisis. The Luftwaffe could not stop the American bombers. Not with conventional tactics, not with superior aircraft, which they no longer possessed. Not with experienced pilots, who were dying faster than they could be replaced. The air war over Europe had been decided, not by a single battle or a single innovation, but by the combination of American industrial capacity, technological adaptation, and tactical evolution. The B-17 Flying Fortress was part of that combination. Its defensive armament, once mocked by Luftwaffe pilots as inadequate, had been integrated into a system that worked. But the system required escorts, and the escorts required range, and range required the P-51 Mustang. Technical Sergeant Robert Johnson, the ball turret gunner who had survived Black Thursday, flew his final combat mission in July of 1944. He had completed his required 25 missions. He had survived when 600 others had not. He had seen the transformation. From the desperate days of October 1943, when bombers flew to Schweinfurt alone and 1 in 5 did not return, to July 1944, when formations of 600 bombers with 800 fighter escorts struck targets across Germany with losses measured in single digits. Johnson was asked by a war correspondent what had changed. His answer was simple: "We got the little friends, the Mustangs. Before they arrived, we were dying. After they arrived, the Germans were dying. That made all the difference." The final accounting of the strategic bombing campaign against Germany reveals the scope of American victory in the air war. From January 1944, when long-range escorts became available, to May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the 8th Air Force flew over 300,000 bomber sorties. They dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs. They destroyed or damaged 70% of Germany's industrial capacity. The cost was significant. Over 44,000 American airmen were killed. Another 50,000 were wounded or captured. The 8th Air Force suffered more casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater. But the campaign achieved its objectives. German aircraft production, despite Albert Speer's best efforts to disperse and protect it, was crippled. German oil production was destroyed. The transportation network was paralyzed, and the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. By March of 1945, American bombers flew over Germany unopposed. The fighter escorts were no longer necessary because there were no German fighters left to oppose them. The skies that had been contested so desperately in 1943 belonged entirely to the Americans by 1945. The transformation was total. The B-17 Flying Fortress and its 1350 caliber machine guns had become exactly what its name promised, not because the bomber could defend itself alone, but because the bomber was part of a system. Combat box formations that maximized defensive firepower, long-range fighter escorts that engaged German interceptors before they reached the bombers, industrial capacity that replaced losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Together, these elements created a weapon system that broke the Luftwaffe. Hauptmann Egon Meyer, the German pilot who had pioneered the head-on attack in November of 1942, did not survive to see the final defeat. He was killed in action on March 2, 1944, shot down by a P-47 Thunderbolt during a bomber escort mission. At the time of his death, he had 78 confirmed kills. He was one of Germany's top aces. But even top aces could not change the mathematics. The Americans had more bombers than Germany had ammunition. They had more fighters than Germany had fuel. They had more trained crews than Germany had airfields. Meyer's head-on attack tactic had been devastating in 1942 and 1943. It had forced the Americans to add chin turrets to the B-17, transforming the E and F models into the heavily armed G model with 13 guns. But even the improved tactics and better defensive armament could not compensate for the lack of fighter escorts. Once the P-51 Mustang arrived, Meyer's tactics became obsolete. German fighters could no longer mass for coordinated attacks. They were engaged by American escorts before they could reach the bombers. And when they did break through to the bombers, they faced the concentrated fire of combat boxes. The kill zone that the title of this story references was not a single location or a single battle. It was the three-dimensional space created by 600 B-17 flying fortresses arranged in combat boxes, each bomber armed with 1350 caliber machine guns, all protected by long-range fighter escorts. That space, that zone, was lethal to any aircraft that entered it. German fighters that attacked American bomber formations in 1944 and 1945 were entering a kill zone from which few emerged. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war carried with them a profound respect for American air power. Not respect born of admiration for individual weapons or tactics, but respect born of facing overwhelming force. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who had shown mercy to the crew of Sky Chariot in August 1943, emigrated to Canada after the war. In 1990, he reconnected with the pilot he had spared, Charles Brown. The two men became friends. They appeared together at air shows and historical events. They told their story to audiences who wanted to understand the human dimension of aerial combat. Stigler was always asked the same question. What was it like to face American bomber formations in the later years of the war? His answer never changed. It was hell. Imagine flying into a storm where every raindrop is a bullet, where every cloud hides a fighter waiting to kill you, where every second you survive is a miracle. That was what it was like to attack American bombers after the Mustangs arrived. You knew you would probably die. But you flew anyway because Germany needed you to fly. Most of my friends died doing exactly that. They flew into the storm and they did not come out. The story of the B-17 and its defensive armament is ultimately a story about the evolution of warfare. The Germans mocked the flying fortress in the early years of the war. They called it a target. They said its guns were impressive but ineffective. They developed tactics specifically designed to exploit its weaknesses. They were correct that the bomber alone could not survive. But they failed to understand that the bomber would not fight alone. The Americans adapted. They developed combat box formations. They produced long-range fighters. They built bombers faster than the Germans could destroy them. They trained crews faster than the Germans could kill them. And they turned the sky itself into a weapon. By 1944, when 600 B-17's formed up over England and set course for Germany, they were not 600 individual aircraft. They were a single unified weapon system. 7,850 caliber machine guns, 6,000 trained gunners, 800 escort fighters, all coordinated through radio communications and practiced tactics. The German fighters that rose to intercept them were not facing bombers. They were facing an industrial nation's entire military capacity, concentrated into a single formation. They were entering a kill zone. The Luftwaffe pilots called it many things. The Americans called it air superiority. Whatever the name, the result was the same. The sky over Europe belonged to the United States Army Air Forces, and that control of the air made possible everything that followed. The D-Day invasion, the liberation of France, the advance into Germany. None of it would have been possible if German fighters still controlled the skies. But they did not control the skies. They had lost control in the spring of 1944 when Mustang escorts arrived in force, and they never regained it. The B-17 Flying Fortress with its 1350 caliber machine guns had fulfilled its destiny. Not by fighting alone, but by fighting as part of a system that transformed American industrial might into military victory. The Germans had mocked those 13 guns. They had laughed at the idea that bombers could defend themselves. They had been right to laugh until they were wrong. And by the time they realized they were wrong, 600 bombers were turning the sky into a kill zone from which there was no escape. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.